Okay, this lesson for the Koine Project class, especially those of you who are laboring in the text using the Bible words, inspired categories, things we can find, and when we use a lexicon, for example, and then we can look the words up, find out what their or ascertain their meanings in context, syntax, all that. So we really need to ask ourselves some of the troubling questions. Well, not some of them, but one of them concerning translation. It was once considered the style of the Bible, let's say the crude language of biblical Hebrew, that block Hebrew where all of the letters can be formed by the same lines in a box, just 4 lines, or the common Greek, not the classical, but the Koine, highly inflected, very wordy. It was noticed that some considered the language or style of the Bible to be embarrassing, so that as the history of translation continued to advance and move forward, we noticed that, today we have very sophisticated language, very advanced abstract constructs, if you will, that are highly developed. Some say that a lot of people are against, quote, the Calvinistic construct because they just can't get it, as if getting it would be the goal. But that's quite diminutive if you notice the insult through implication, as if the one saying he gets it can then explain it, or Arminianism or Lutheranism or Catholicism, all of Protestantism and Judaism, Islam, whatever. But in the Western world, we have a Western Occidental mind. We have our English literature, which is quite a masterpiece. And some have noticed that it even excels the Koine, common Greek, for example, or the biblical Hebrew. And perhaps it does in literary style, achieving some purpose of appreciation that wasn't intended in the original, if you will, early forms of language. But it's striking that those of us who are part of this apologetic and outreach that's language-based, we notice that it did prevail in assuring that the purpose of the scripts, the context, the words, the grammars, why certain lessons were selected. For example, John's Gospel said that there were many other things that Jesus had done, and perhaps had all of those been recorded, the world as we know it couldn't contain it all. And today we know about cognitive overload and information. If all the information we had in electronic format were to materialize into hard copy, paper and ink, we don't think that to be hyper anymore. We wouldn't know what to do with all of it. Well, it goes on and says, though, these scripted miracles, signs, have been written and remain on record, that perfect tense, in order that the reader, the hearer of that gospel and the gospel today might believe. The purpose was that you might believe, simple form of action, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that as one who is believing, you might have life in his name. So we know that people who had trusted the Messiah to come needed this record to know not to trust the false or another Messiah, but rather to trust this one particularly. And we know that those who had not heard, had not read or been instructed this good news, and had not heard the proclamation of this good news, that they could have confidence by these scripted miracles, and of course being convinced by the Holy Spirit in that proclamation that is compelling, if you will, the speaker. Then we have reason to know that people have read the Gospel of John and trusted Jesus. So that where we're at today is the design and intention of the scriptures and the languages that he used to originally inspire and produce the Bible in and according to Hebrew, for example, and Koine Greek. Those might lack the literary style that we appreciate, for example, in the unsurpassed literary masterpiece called the King James version of the Bible. And I mean the refined version as the most appropriate, the best form it can be in, which we've learned through history that was from feedback by members of local ecclesias, New Testament ecclesias, who insisted that the format be as excellent as the Bible in the English Bible deserves. And it was. Matter of fact, you can read in history, 1850, the people that were categorized by some as Baptists, but the Baptists, like the word evangelist, not the denominations or the religion, but those who actually function and carry out the work of preaching the gospel and baptizing those who believe it, they insisted and catalyzed Cambridge University so that in 1850, when they did that, by 1873, F.H.A. Scribner had gone and painstakingly worked to assure that obvious mistakes, printing, whatever you call all of that, in editing and formatting and mass producing, all of those mistakes were removed. The best form that was called for and it warranted was achieved in what is called the 1873 KJV. But originally, people, almost with disdain, even Calvin spoke of ridicule Paul's writing, for example, as if now that could happen where we can, if you don't notice the point of the scriptures, which was to point us to Christ and to speak concerning him, then you might, as most religionists, even today, especially in our culture, are very disappointed because the text just doesn't serve their end. And we can all be like that. We can go look in the Bible for a verse for what we need and what we want to do with it, forgetting that it was intelligently designed and formatted, and that was in its production, inspiration. And then we know God's providence in assuring that we would have, even, let's say, in an English-speaking world, he would assure that we, who are in this Western world, for example, would have the best form of its literary style, which is unsurpassed. I have never taken issue with the literary masterpiece of the King James. I have been quite concerned with people who tout it but don't use it, as if somehow they can just appropriate it as an identity. And you all have run into that, where people say they don't want anything to do with Greek or Hebrew, they're just King James only, and then you're aghast when you find they don't bother with the English either. And the first time I was told, when I was studying Hebrew or Greek, someone said, "You study Greek and Hebrew?" I said, "You study English." They said, "Why'd you say that?" I said, "Well, if you read the English Bible, I don't accuse you of studying English. Why, if I read Greek and Hebrew, do you say I'm studying Greek and Hebrew?" Well, it didn't occur to them that they had not noticed that we had been unhitched, if you will, disconnected from those languages that were instrumental in communicating and assuring that the purpose of the scriptures were always there. For example, the Koine Greek is very disappointing if you, let's say, if I'm talking with a Calvinist on one hand and Arminian on the other hand, who self-identify and willingly submit themselves to be primed and indoctrinated according to those constructs. Neither of them will be very satisfied in the conversation because on one hand, one will think, aha, that supports mine, or aha, that supports my view. Then they'll find, as one great professor said once, Dr. Roger Copeland, that he notices there's extremes, but he respects the middle. And our systematic theology teacher, Dr. John Owen, said extremes are least responsible. You can just call that extreme point, and then you're basically not responsible for context, a systematic approach according to the expired categories. You don't have the letters to search through. As the hermeneutics professor taught us, a holistic approach. That's a lot of work because you're assuring the end in mind for which the scriptures were designed is accomplished. So what do we do about the embarrassing literary style when we read, let's say, some of you are doing work and trying to communicate the meaning according to the inflectional morphemes, and you're so wordy that it's crude. It can almost be crude when someone hears it. But that's instructional purposes, not for literary style and how something might resonate. And again, no one has really, I'm not sure anyone's ever produced a Bible that holds such a level of literary style and is a masterpiece of it than the refined, if you will, by God's people, because they were the ones using it as a rule of faith and practice. Ironically, the original King James Bible, for example, was intended to be placed in a building where you would have to attend to have it read to you, but you certainly wouldn't leave with it, and you certainly wouldn't use it as your faith and practice. You would submit yourself as and be compliant, if you will, to the state established religion and its dogmas as decreed to you. So, for example, that's the divine right of kings, if you will. So instead of taking their responsibility under the headship of the King of Kings, they usurped him and said, we will decree what you believe and what you practice, and we will have the information, and we'll have people that work for the state in the interest of. And so if that were ever off the mark, then you're going against the very conscience of God's people, and we won't betray Christ. And of course, you know the rest of the history. So what we have is that a lot of our constructs were never attached and correlative and tethered, if you will, and anchored and restrained by the original text. And so they moved on. A great controversy happened in the last couple of years, or few years maybe, but Dr. Charles Stanley's son, Andy Stanley, made a comment and a very ardent, adamant affirmation that we need to unhitch from the Old Testament or disconnect from it. Well, when it comes to constructs, what a lot of us are now learning is they were never hitched or connected or correlative to the original text. Rather, those original crude, if you will, texts lack such style and failed to meet what was wanting, seemingly very advanced, developed, systematic constructs. But according to systematic theologian that I consider unsurpassed, Dr. John E. Owen, we were to use the Bible from Genesis to Revelation as the content through a systematic evaluation and achieve a systematic, intelligible theology that can be communicated without contradicting the scriptures. Now that's a work. It's like the holistic hermeneutics professor, Dr. John E. Penn, where bring in your language, bring in your grammar and your syntax, and bring in your context, take your systematic approach, and all of that together becomes a holistic approach that results in the best outcome for the glory of God and the good of others. And for example, the language teacher, Dr. Randy Murray, taught us to so adhere to the language and the inflectional morphemes that if you began to move away, it would sound like the tearing of Velcro. So, and I appreciate his adherence to the morphemes, the inflection. That's present tense. No, that's aorist tense. No, that's a aorist participle. No, that's periphrastic participle. Periphrastic perfect participle. Need to notice this, notice that. That's imperfect. That's anyway, on and on and on. So, and then holistic hermeneutics, and then a systematic theologian who insisted on a categorical approach, take the Bible words, those categories, and have a systematic theology that actually correlates, indicates, and communicates what the Bible teaches rather than contradicts. So those three gentlemen together in the same school, as that legacy continues in the Missionary Baptist Seminary, for example, they really don't see moving away from the text progress. They don't consider a systematic theology that is apart from the inspired categories anything that would be worthy of systemizing. And they certainly don't consider a hermeneutic that is missing parts to be holistic and intact and to reflect the integrity of the scriptures. So that's quite a commitment they have and continue to carry out that legacy. So that's a good lesson, and we'll end there, and you all just continue to labor. But notice that it's not a crudeness, and it doesn't lack literary style. It is deliberately designed to secure the end in mind and the purpose for which it was scripted originally, and the purpose for which it was preserved on record for us today. So the literary style is actually a gracious benefit for us to appreciate things we read, and how in such a masterful way in our culture the language is communicated to us, for us to appreciate it. But for us to abandon the original intention and the teaching that corresponds to it was to abuse the labor and the toil and even the bloodshed of all those who gave their lives to assure that we had and still have a Bible that assures that the interest of Christ, that his Father received the glory by him in the ecclesia, is always carried out throughout all the ages. So have a blessed day.